All right, so we are here for our final monthly CISMA call of the year. This is hosted by FISC's Partnership Assistance and Communications Committee, FISC-PAC, formerly FISP, and we're here to help support the Florida CISMA's cooperative invasive species management areas, which are regional partnerships across the state. And there's lots of amazing work that all of our CISMAs do. And so for today's presentation, we'll be hearing about new research looking at python habitat use from Brandon Welty with University of Florida. And then we'll be getting a CISMA update from our CISMA, Diane Alex, and then I'll be giving an update on the FISPAC activities. So we'll go ahead and stop sharing and hand that over to Brandon.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen real quick.
And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we will have time for questions at the end of the, should have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And I'm seeing your main slide screens.
Okay, perfect. Just the slides, correct?
Yep.
All right, awesome. All right, I'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Brandon Welty. I'm a graduate student at the University of Florida's Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department. And today I'll just be giving a general overview and some updates on some preliminary analysis that we've done on our Python Scout telemetry project. First off, this is I want to mention an interagency collaborative effort. The project is between UF, USGS. There's a lot of people working on this, as well as, of course, our funding agency partners at the South Florida Water Management District and FWC. So I won't go into too much of a background on Burmese pythons in South Florida because I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of a lot of this information. But essentially, Burmese pythons, semi-aquatic, large constrictor, native to Southeast Asia, introduced originally through the pet trade, and at least one initial establishment in the southern region of Everglades National Park prior to 1985, and since the 2000s, there's been this exponential population growth of pythons throughout Southwest Florida or South Florida. And impacts, pythons have led to dramatic declines of these mammal populations in Everglades National Park. Dramatic declines, and some of those species include, threatened and endangered species. Pythons have also been implicated in the introduction of a novel lung parasite into our Florida snake, our native snake population. It's a parasite native to Asia, commonly referred to as RO now, and it has been implicated in the death of several wild native snakes, but there's a lot more research that's needed to know the real impact of the parasite on native snakes. And there's a lot of people, including my advisor, Dr. Melissa Miller, who are working on this, and some people throughout the state. It's now, I believe it's currently up to 17 different species of native snake that it has been found in. So from a management perspective, just generally, with Burmese pythons, there's a lot of difficulties, and a lot of that is because of the areas that they occupy, which are these very remote, dense and largely aquatic, seasonally flooded environments, and a lot of those areas are largely inaccessible without some sort of specialized equipment. Airboats are tracked vehicles. So there's this huge area in the interior of the Everglades where access is so limited that any sort of management with pythons in that area is increasingly difficult. And just in general, management is difficult because python detection probability is extremely low. If a python's present, it's less than 5% of a detection probability, and that's a combination of just their cryptic coloration and their behavior. And a lot of the habitat that they're found in is, it's not really conducive to spotting snakes in to begin with, and coupled with their ecology, it's a very hard species to manage. There have been a lot of um, removal efforts over the years, trapping detection dog visual surveys, and of course that includes researchers and the Florida Wildlife Commissions and South Florida Water Management Districts contractor programs. But interestingly, and I think it's significant that a lot of, or almost all of those pythons that are removed in South Florida are removed along roadways or levees. And it raises the interesting question, which I'm going to kind of touch on is it, because these pythons are just on roads and levees, or is it because these are the only areas we can really access? So there have been several scout snake programs across South Florida. Some of those are ongoing. Some of those have, were conducted in the past. Right now, we have Ian in the Conservancy in Southwest Florida doing their scout snake program, and USGS in Big Cypress. But most of those studies are kind of focused habitat-wise in these higher elevation habitats, and higher elevation doesn't mean much when you're talking about the Everglades, but that little bit of elevation does contribute to some drastic differences in habitat composition. And there's a pretty large information gap in regards to python ecology in the eastern and central portions of the Everglades complex, which is dominated by sawgrass marsh and interspersed with sloughs and tree islands. So project-wide with our collaborators and everything, there's a couple of different objectives. I'll be focusing on movement and habitat use in this region. We're also looking at some different tools and methods to reduce resources needed for tracking programs. And our collaborators are working on using that demographic data to inform models estimating python abundance. So our study site is Everglades Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area. It's 672,000 acres spanning across 3 South Florida counties. It's a very, very large study area. And as I mentioned, this is a primarily aquatic habitat that experiences seasonal flooding during the rainy season. Some of these areas are annually inundated with water. There are also levees and canals and some spoil islands that kind of border these canals that run through and around Everglades Francis S. Taylor. And really these levee spoil islands, these anthropogenic structures provide a lot of the annual year-round dry habitat found in this area. So our project was initiated in November of 2022. So we're just at 2 years tracking. Ideally, we're tracking 14 pythons twice a week. Most of our snakes, almost all of them, were obtained opportunistically from FWC and South Florida Water Management District contractors. And that 14 number does change periodically. That's our goal, but snakes sometimes are removed or die, or that's our aim though. And twice a week does change, which is due to just the general difficulties of tracking in this habitat. Each snake gets 2 VHF tags just in case one were to fail. We've also started utilizing accelerometers. and to look at some more fine scale movement in some of our snakes. But we're collecting data on movement, habitat use, behavior, and then the vital rates. So short video just to kind of demonstrate what a typical tracking event in Francis Taylor looks like. As you can see, it's very wet and it's full of very dense vegetation, which does keep things interesting. And you can see, the difficulties in access to some of these areas, just tracking in general. So I'm just gonna go into some of our preliminary results and some preliminary analysis that we've seen so far with our tracking data. So now it's now at over 1,300 location coordinates, total collected for the entire project. The average tracking duration for snakes was 402 days and a range of 9 to 595 days. Obviously, some of those snakes are brand new as older snakes are replaced. Average daily movement, 96 meters with a range of around 35 to 162 meters. And then the average total distance moved was around 41,240 meters with a pretty large range in that. Again, some of that is newer snakes, but we have seen a lot of movement from some other individuals. All right, so some of the analysis that we're doing and modeling we're doing is looking at variation in Brownian motion. And essentially what that is a reflection of the degree of randomness in the animal's movement between two consecutive locations. So that higher variance in Brownian motion indicates more erratic or less predictable movement, while the lower variance implies a more directed or straight line linear movements. And we can use those changes to kind of elucidate seasonal patterns. These figures are by month and year to see how those seasonal changes are influenced either by behavior, such as breeding or foraging. And this is for 3 of our snakes. So far, we've been able to analyze 12 individuals. So for all 12, this motion variance peaked in December for 6 of those 12 snakes, which does coincide with the python breeding season, which generally starts December and runs through March. And what you can see is some of that increased erratic movement really starts to happen around October, November into December, and then kind of levels off post-breeding season. Interestingly, for 4 of these 6 pythons that didn't have these peaks of motion variance in this time of year were females that didn't exhibit any sort of breeding behavior for that year. So we didn't observe them with any males or they didn't produce a clutch. So we're also modeling occurrence distribution using dynamic Brownian bridge movement models. And essentially what that is, occurrence distribution is the likelihood an animal has or will occupy an area based on previous movements over time. And this model uses our spatial data to estimate the probabilistic movement path of an animal. But it, as opposed to some other traditional space use models, what it does is it incorporates both the time intervals between consecutive locations and that motion variance that I was just discussing, or the randomness to estimate where the animal likely traveled between known positions. Um, and it adjusts that variance dynamically, hence the dynamic part of the name, along the movement path, which can account for changes in that movement behavior. So what you're seeing here are four of those models, and this estimates at the 90 and 95% contour. What that means is that's 90% of your points and 95% of your points. And that 95% contour is kind of the accepted basis for a occurrence distribution for an animal. But you can see that in the green contour, or the one that's a little larger, and that would include points that would fall into a broader range for the individual. And it's interesting because you can kind of see some more condensed or smaller contours as these snakes travel in a more linear path along levees, which we do see them do in that top left. You can see in the bottom of those contours how it's more of a condensed straight line, and as the snake moves down those levees and then starts to spread out into the marsh, jumps between levees, those contours get a little bigger. Just a representation that the snake is moving more out, off. And like the top right, that's a snake that spends a lot of time out into the marsh, and you can see that that's reflected in that model. So across all snakes, the average occurrence distribution at the 95% contour for males, as of now, is 67, just about 68 square kilometers, and much smaller for our female snakes at 28.36 square kilometers. And just based off of some of the other spatial analysis that have been done using the telemetry projects in South Florida in some of those different habitats, ours do appear to be, a larger, snakes are using a larger area in this aquatic habitat. And that also includes the analysis done in their native region, Thailand, by Smith et al., where she found that, that occurrence distribution was pretty significantly smaller than what we're seeing in our snakes in this habitat. So just some interesting some things we're seeing. So levees and canals do not seem to act as any sort of barrier for movement. All the red dots in this figure are a known canal crossing from this one individual male snake. We know of 15 different canal crossings for this snake. And you would maybe assume that they would not expose themselves so much in these deep open water canals where there's tons of alligators, they're at risk of predation, but it does not seem to deter them. They freely cross canals often, they cross levees often, and it's no deterrence. And just we are seeing some very, very large movements from some of these individuals. This is from one of our telemetered males. And he was initially caught on a levee, C304, if anyone's familiar with that area. Kind of hung out where he was caught initially for, quite a while, and then in July 2023 started moving out into the marsh. Over the next 6 months moved almost 68 kilometers, and then doing eventually a hard turn right back to the area he initially was caught in during breeding season. And he spent a lot of time in the marsh and then kind of ended up back in that general area, some more on spoil islands, near spoil islands during breeding season. And it's can be indicative of that snakes move pretty easily through water. And if it's a largely aquatic habitat, they might be facilitating some of those large movements and dispersal. So as far as habitat use, you can see in this is a figure of the proportion of snake locations, and this is every occurrence where we could you know ground truth that this is the habitat that the snake was in visually. And you can see marsh is the predominant habitat type used for every month, but you kind of see some interesting some upticks in some tree island usage in May and June. Um, and that does coincide with some wading bird nesting seasons. I can say just from tracking these snakes and going to those areas, these snakes, a couple of these individuals were in areas, a little bit closer to levees, not really any sort of difference in habitat structure around where they were. And then during those months, seem to move pretty straight line out to some of those large interior tree islands that, while we were tracking, observed um, numerous wading. I mean, tree islands are full of wading birds at that time of year. It's hard to see any sort of food bolus or anything in our snakes. We hardly ever see our snakes on dry ground. So, and if they're eating um, primarily birds and small mammals, food bolus it doesn't look like a deer inside of a python. So it's hard to say for sure that they moved there, just because there was this large presence of wading birds on those tree islands. But we do know from some other research that's gone on that they do raid nests of wading birds on tree islands. So it's certainly a possibility. You also see that increase in the levee usage in around those same months. It's likely due to females seeking out suitable nesting habitat. So as the project's going on and we track these snakes more and more, what I started to notice is, the snakes may not actually be on the levees, but they cluster around them a lot of times. Sometimes they're, a couple meters off the levee, 100 meters off the levee, but generally for some of these individuals, they've never really traveled too far away from the levees for the most part. So what I did, again, this is just preliminary analysis, is just create this 30-meter buffer around all the levees in our study area, and then saw that 20% of all of our spatial points fall within that 30-meter buffer. And that's 30 meters isn't much. And that range was from 0 to 56% for individual snakes. So some of those snakes spent no time, or we did not observe them spending any time within that buffer. And then others spent quite a majority of time, 56% of all points fall within that. And if you were to increase that just a little bit, that number would obviously go up. As you can see from that figure, a lot of those points are, just outside that 30-meter buffer. And, these levees likely provide some increased foraging opportunities for pythons. Of course, there's, wading birds, there's alligators in the marsh, but the levees still do have rodents, other small mammals, which you do still see some smaller mammals in Francis Taylor. Not like if you drive down Main Park Road, we do still see occasionally see possums and raccoons out there. So they are on the levees. So what we've recently started doing is tracking at night because, generally pythons tend to move and forage at night. So we're trying to see if maybe those snakes that do really hang close to these levees consistently are actually coming up on them at night to forage. And we've seen some slight behavioral changes with some of the snakes where they are coming up to the edges or they're more exposed at night. Behavior that looks like foraging stretched out as opposed to just curled up sheltering during the day like we always see them. We haven't been doing it that long, but it will be interesting to see if that really, kind of changes our perspective on how they're using that environment. So another thing that was came as kind of a surprise for our interior snakes, or a surprise to me, was the use of these tussocks. And these tussocks are pretty abundant in some of our more interior marsh areas in the study areas. Anyone doesn't know, it's just essentially a floating mud mat of vegetation that, some of them are really new, some of them are really old, and they're essentially a floating tree island. They do have trees on them sometimes, but they have also this dense foliage that provides pretty good python habitat, and they're certainly using them. This female you can see in this photo, that's where she spent the majority of her time, was just hopping around to these little tussocks. And I say small, a couple meters wide to 20 meters wide, but not large. But they're certainly using them to shelter, and I imagine there's other things going on out there, but from what we saw, it was a lot of like just sheltering and behavior wise. And wish that figure was a little more zoomed out so you could get a perspective of like where that area is. But that is interior marsh. It's very far from any sort of levee or really even airboat trail. So a snake like that, if they stay in that area, will likely not be observed by a human. So we also use these snakes as scout snakes during the breeding season, to remove associate snakes when they aggregate. So we found this past breeding season, we're about to go into the next breeding season. So it's a busy time of year, but both breeding aggregations we found were in the marsh. And that center picture, I know it's not the best picture. It's kind of hard to make out what's going on. But when I took the picture, I was more thinking about how I'm about to try to catch all these snakes in the marsh. But anyway, um, what it is it's mats of laid down cattail that are so dense and so thick that it's able to support the weight of not only one snake but multiple snakes. That center picture is a 6 python breeding aggregation, 7 including our telemetered male. That's not even in the photo. Um, and it's can't say for sure whether that was an airboat that had came through that area and laid down all those cattail, or it was the snakes themselves or something else. But both of those aggregations were found in very, very similar habitat, where these mats of laid down cattail were just facilitating this python breeding ball, which was really surprising to see. And actually, last year, all breeding activity that we observed was in the marsh. So not just our 2 breeding aggregations, but we did observe breeding pairs in the marsh. And that was under similar conditions where it was just maybe a smaller patch of sawgrass or cattail, a couple meters wide, and there's breeding pairs of pythons on them. So we observed 12 pythons. We were able to capture 8, so we did all right. Again, it's difficult to catch breeding pythons in the marsh. Oh, and that's so where that is, water depth. It's about a meter to 2 meters. So pretty deep in certain areas. So, and that's an area that's inundated with water. So that's essentially dry land that's now out there. So of the 7 females that we tracked during the last 2 reproductive seasons, 2 produced clutches last year, 3 produced clutches this year. Out of the 5 nests, all but 1 were associated with levees. That 1 additional nest was on a spoil island on the along the L67 canal. That's the nest you can see in the top 2 photos. In the bottom 2 photos, that is a nest on the bottom edge of the levee. The python, the brooding python, is difficult to see in the picture on the left on the bottom, but that was after I removed that grass and vegetation to expose her head. So that nest was actually depredated shortly after discovery by vultures. Our crew went back out just a couple days later to deploy some cameras, and they drove up on those vultures actively depredating that nest. So actively consuming eggs, and that nest was completely destroyed. Female was close by, but just a couple meters, and she had abandoned that nest. And it's I think indicative of these anthropogenic structures. The spoil islands are not a natural component of this area, and the levees, obviously aren't as well. And they really do seem to be facilitating that python reproduction in this, habitat that's primarily aquatic. Pythons need dry habitat for successful nests, and these these structures certainly seem to be facilitating that. Did see some interesting evidence of some possible nesting site fidelity when we went to remove one of the clutches from this year inside a burrow on a levee. As we were digging it up, we found the remains of an old python nest. So we know that female didn't produce a clutch the previous year because we were tracking her. Some interesting questions. Do they reuse nesting sites? With the help of USGS, we're going to do some analysis of the eggshell to see if the egg is from our tagged female. Regardless, I think it's interesting that of all of the burrows along these levees, and there's a lot of them, that potentially two different pythons chose to nest in the same exact burrow. So during our first year, we did have one python that was struck by a vehicle. We had another die that was kind of mysterious. We just found the snake in the marsh. But then this year, just starting in July of this year, we've had three of our pythons die, and there's a lot of evidence of alligator predation on all of those snakes. Kind of weird scenario. We'd go out and either find one or both transmitters, usually one, with some pretty obvious teeth marks in it, which you can see in that bottom photo. That's a transmitter, and you can see that indent where it's been bitten. The top photo is the remains of that same large female that was basking on that tussock, and that is actually on one of those tussocks, and that's all that remained of a 4.5 meter python. So that was a little surprising. All the snakes seemed pretty healthy prior to that, so it points to alligator predation. I mean, we know it goes the other way. We know our pythons eat alligators, and we know alligators eat pythons, but based on our study, compared to some of the other telemetry projects that have gone on in South Florida, it seems that that mortality rate from, be it alligators or whatever is happening is higher. And that may be another component of these snakes spending so much time in these areas of high alligator abundance. It's we're always tracking near alligators, sometimes very close to alligators. They're always a presence when we're tracking these snakes, and it's possible that since these snakes are spending so much time in these primarily aquatic habitats that have these large alligators, forcing this interaction, maybe a little more in this area than some of those other areas where the snakes do occupy some more upland habitats most of the time. So what have we learned so far? There is a reason there's an information gap in this area. As you can see from pictures and video, it's difficult tracking. It's possible that the detection in this area is even lower, because of the aquatic nature, the dense vegetation, the remoteness of this area. And again, seems like that area the snakes are occupying, the occurrence distribution is a little bit larger. And they could be using the canals and that seasonal flooding for some of those long distance movements. That's something I hope to look at, looking at movement compared to annual water levels, because those do fluctuate quite a bit in this area, and see if there is any sort of correlation between high water, more movement, or if it's more of just a seasonal behavior thing, breeding and whatnot. And also just how they're really using this environment, what kind of habitat they're using. I mean, the breeding aggregations aside, it is very common for us to go out, track an individual, and find it in the marsh, on um, these mats of cattail and aquatic vegetation. They're completely out of the water. They're very, very hidden. They're um, doing all the things they need to do that they would kind of normally do on dry land, but they're doing it in the marsh. Um, and we know that breeding aggregations also occur on dry land in this area, found in this area. But it is interesting that you know, we now know that they are also spending a lot of time out there and breeding out in these more remote interior areas. Um, and I think, all of this data, the habitat use, the movement, all of that is going to help us implement better management strategies in this area where there is this knowledge gap, and where most of these captures are happening around these roads and levees. It can better inform when and where to look for these snakes. If we know they're using these, you know, dense mats of cattail to form breeding aggregations, maybe we can, hone in on those areas that are really what we're learning is suitable, good habitat for some of these behaviors to occur, and we can take that and implement it in some of our management strategies. So what's next? We're trying to implement drones to track as well. Sure, some of you are familiar with the recent legislation that was passed that regarding use of drones and where they were manufactured. That whole mess, but that really set us back on our timeline for that. But we are hopefully very close to beginning to implement that. We're also looking to use GPS, and we've designed and redesigned. A snake's body type doesn't really lend to attaching a GPS to it. Kind of a cylinder. It's not as easy as just putting a collar on a deer or something. But we're working with a manufacturer to design that and hopefully, come up with something that can kind of fill in those data gaps that you are just, a natural component of telemetry. Find out what's going on in between those tracking events, and then continue to work with our partners and our collaborators to utilize that data on movement demography to inform those statistical models, hopefully estimating abundance. All right, that is all I have. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come out and share this with you all. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brandon. That was a fantastic presentation. So we've got one question in the chat already. Are declining populations of small mammals having any limiting effect on the python populations?
That's a good question. It's something I've wondered a lot about. The problem is pythons are, they'll eat anything. They're, in certain areas, they'll deplete small mammal populations, but there's still quite a bit of rodents. And we've actually seen that even very large pythons that you wouldn't think would really, be focused on eating a rat, they will still continue to eat rats. They just eat a lot of them. And there's still plenty of wading birds out there. There's still plenty of wildlife. Not to say that, the impact isn't severe for what they've done to wildlife populations, but they still have plenty of options. So, I can't say definitively if it did have any impact on a population-wide level, but anecdotally, I would probably say no, because there are still opportunities out there for them.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, Steve,
Do you have any other questions?
tell me a deer story. I don't like that.
Elizabeth, do you have
Hey.
a question? Hey,
Oh.
go ahead.
Well, this is Diane. I put it in the chat, but I'll just ask it out loud. Are you finding are the individual snakes territorial at all, or will they be like overlapping with each other in the same home ranges?
We see a lot of overlap. There doesn't seem to be any sort of territoriality, even during breeding season. We've actually had two males that we were tracking um, essentially mirror each other's movements at the start of that breeding season, where one moves down the levee, the other one's right behind him, and then last year even ending up in the same burrow at one point. And this was kind of early breeding season. We never found a female in that burrow, and I was shocked that we didn't. But then they didn't stay in there too long. They just kept. They use, females lay down pheromones. These males track them. So it seemed like maybe they were just trying to find her. But as far as territoriality, it doesn't seem to really be the case.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Any other questions in the group? I have one thinking about the how they tend to show up on like the tussocks and in a little bit of those higher areas. I don't know if the technology is really there yet, especially for field processing, but maybe someday would it be potential to try some of that ground-based LiDAR and see if you might be able to use that to help detect pythons maybe a bit more quickly in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered the same thing because the LiDAR is getting so advanced, even looking at different types of the aquatic vegetation and stuff out there and in those tussocks. And it's definitely something that I think has potential, from management, from a management perspective, because just even being on the airboat out there and consistently tracking and driving around these tussocks, you kind of hone in pretty quickly on which ones look really good for a python, which ones necessarily don't look that good for a python. So if you could then implement LiDAR to kind of hone in on those areas, I think there's a real possibility there to kind of narrow down and do some targeted surveys. And that's something that I hope comes from this as well, is some more of these like targeted surveys, because you look at a map, for instance, Taylor, and you're like, where do you even start? Um, but if we can use tools like that and kind of hone in on those areas, I think it will be productive.
We've got another question. Have any pythons been found in wading bird colonies near the L67?
Near the L67, a little north of the L67, but not far. The pythons that we found in the wading bird colonies this last year were just south of 75. So there's a couple bigger colonies out there, and that's generally where we found them. So not too far from the L67, but just a little north of there.
Any other questions? All right. Well, you can always reach out later on for Brandon if you do. Go ahead and hand it over to Diane.
All right. Are you seeing my presentation?
Yep, I'm seeing just the slides up there now.
Okay.
Or the single slide.
Sweet. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Deb, for the opportunity to talk to the group today. My name's Diane Alex. I am a project coordinator with the Nature Conservancy in the Apalachicola region. And along with Pedro Elliott from FNA, he and I are the co-chairs for the Apalachicola CISMA. And how do I advance? There we go. So this is an arm of the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance. also known by the acronym ARSA, which was formed by the collaboration of land managers within the region that recognized our mutual goals of sustaining the high biodiversity that's associated with the Apalachicola River and its surrounding communities. And this is largely through reciprocal fire use, mutual assistance, land management, sharing information, and communicating to the public. Our main vehicle for this is an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with 11 signatories from the regional. We cover from the Choctawhatchee River in the west to the Osceola in the east. And this is kind of a map of that with the conservation lands highlighted. I mentioned prescribed fire already, but also restoration, particularly longleaf pine and the associated ground cover community. Are also focuses for the group, and then invasive species management as well, which is where the CISMA comes in. So getting into that aspect specifically, we've been rolling out more activities over the past year, including we had a training / work day at a City of Tallahassee park last fall, and this included few early detection species for our region, smallleaf spiderwort, bridal veil, Japanese ardisia, and Japanese false spleenwort. And we had staff from FWC lead the group through some of the identifying characteristics, particularly for the ardisia and the spleenwort, including the distinctions between the invasive fern and some of the rarer native ferns that were also on the site. And then we had the workday portion where we walked through herbicide mixing and sprayed some of the things we were trying to get rid of. And then just last month, we had another workday on Wakulla State Park in their river sinks track, which was working to target some climbing fern, Japanese climbing fern, that was very prevalent in that portion of the park. We've also been trying to get some more outreach activities out there. We participated in the Fire Fest at Tall Timbers back in February, which the event had over 1,400 people attend. And we got a lot of great questions from the public, mostly about particular species and management options at home. And just this past weekend, we attended the Tallahassee Science Festival. And this upcoming weekend, we'll be at the St. Mark Monarch Fest. And another thing that happened this past year, in February, FNA held their invasive plant identification and management workshop up in Quincy, which was pretty well attended with over 60 people. And then this summer, we stole this idea from our neighbors at Six Rivers, and we had a workshop in July in Quincy again. For some continuing education. We had 6 different speakers for the day, and they covered topics such as safe herbicide application, control techniques for spiderwort and recent research on that, giant salvinia and Azolla pinnata, and how our regional status of those two. Challenges related to invasives management on Lake Jackson with its changing water levels. And then principles of weed biocontrol. And this had about 30 people attending from a variety of organizations, and we had some great discussions during break and during a round robin. And another development recently is that, well, Deb provided instructions and Pedrick got in there and got our website working and to be a little more functional. So that's been a nice improvement. So take a look if you have a minute. And then as for future plans, I think it sounds like others on this call probably are in this boat too. If we have an EDRR list that's aged and we need to update it. So we've developed a committee for that. We're trying to work through that. And we are also, identifying more outreach opportunities and encouraging our members to use EdMaps more actively. And we've been exploring more workday ideas for the fall and upcoming spring. And so that's all I have for you. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out that fancy website, or if you want to be added to the mailing list, my email address is right there. So great. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Diane. Lots of cool stuff that you're doing to help protect a really unique environment up here. Any questions for Diane? All right, well, if you have one, feel free to reach out to her later. And I'm going to end our call with just updates on the statewide events and what all is going on across the state right now. So as we are heading into fall, like Diane said, it's a great time to get out and do those work days, and we have a lot of those popping up on our calendar now, looking across the state. One thing I forgot to add on here, we do have the CISMA EDRR meeting where we're looking at that process and how to improve that. If you don't already have the invite for that and you'd like to attend, that's this Friday at 2, send me an email. But there's also several good workshops. There's Central Florida CISMA is doing an aquatic workshop next week. And we've got some of our virtual like ongoing networks like the First Fridays. So lots of great work continuing across the state. Looking at potential announcements, there's some really cool graphics and figurines that FWC has produced with UCF. And so I will be sending these out on the monthly digest in a couple of weeks. But if you don't want to wait a couple of weeks to get them, you can email Robin at FWC to get some copies of these really good outreach materials. This is, like I said earlier, our last call for the year. But we've already got most of the 2025 schedule figured out. And so we've got a lot of exciting topics coming up for next year. There's still a few open slots. So if you have a topic you'd like to see or you have a project you'd like to share about, please let me know. And all of our calls are recorded and available on our YouTube channel, and you can follow us on social media. And with that, I will go ahead and end the call. Diane, I see there was a comment in there. Oh, yeah, and you got that. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the year. Get some time out there as the weather's getting better. Enjoy these natural areas that we work so hard to protect. So thank you all very much and have a great day.